Welcome to #Wednesdays Weekly, a weekly information session in collaboration with voluntary sector and public sector partners. Thank you for joining us for this week's session on volunteer policies, which is delivered by Laura Augustine from Action Together. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Hayley. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura. I'm from Action Together. Today I'm going to be taking you through volunteer policies and also the agreement. As Hayley said, there should be time for questions at the end. So as we're going through, if you have any, if you could put them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end if I can. If for any reason I can't answer any questions, I will get back to you with the presentation I send out afterwards. So I'll just share my screen. Can everybody see that? Yeah. So volunteer policies and agreements. So I thought I'd start off with a bit about myself. So for those that don't know, I'm Laura Augustine. I started with Action Together back in 2019. I started as a volunteer myself. I worked in the volunteer centre alongside Phil Greenwood, so helping to register and broker volunteers into organisations. I also had the chance to attend grassroots gatherings in person, which was great to meet people and watch new connections being made at the time. And then, as we all know, things quickly changed. So in February 2020, I was employed by Action Together, my job role being volunteering and admin assistant. And then a month later, unfortunately, we went into lockdown, so the remote working started. I now work mainly in registering and brokering volunteers, supporting Phil at VSAN, which is a Voluntary Social Action Network, Grassroots Gatherings, Food Solutions Network, amongst quite a few other things. But a new thing that I've been trained on by Sarah Pierce, which I'm taking on now, is helping to support in developing volunteer policies and agreements, which is what I'm going to share with you today. So what is a volunteer policy? So a volunteer policy is a framework for a volunteer programme, which helps define the role of volunteers within the organisation and how they can expect to be treated. So your policy will and should outline clearly to all staff, volunteers and members of the service why volunteers are involved. And just to note, if your organisation hasn't yet started to work with volunteers and you're thinking about doing, it's a good ideal starting point to consider exactly how you want to work with volunteers and how you want volunteers to be shown in your volunteer policy. It's a good idea to run it past staff and other members of your organisation first. So why is a volunteer policy important? Well, having a volunteer policy in place shows that you've thought and you've put a lot of thought and you actually care about having volunteers working and volunteering in your organisation. For staff and volunteers, it communicates how volunteers are involved in your organisation. For volunteers themselves, they can find useful information on how they're engaged within the organisation. For example, what the procedures are for expenses, for example, what support's available, but also what training's available. Consistency is an important one, so it's important for both staff, for staff as well, but volunteers to be shown how consistent you are in how you work with volunteers, for them to feel valued within your organisation. And the last one I've put on there is boundaries. So a volunteer policy can help clarify boundaries between paid staff and volunteers. And an example of that would be like with the expenses. So you tend to offer expenses to volunteers, but not necessarily to paid staff, although that depends on your organisation, you may offer it to paid staff as well. Next slide. So what should a volunteer policy include? Shortly, I'll be showing you a volunteer policy that I've just recently developed for the community warehouse, but I'm going to just stop sharing for a moment and open it up. If anyone has any ideas as to what a volunteer policy should include, please feel free to unmute or write in the chat before I show the policy to yourselves. Anybody want to have a go? No, that's fine. So I'll just go back to sharing the screen, which I'll open the policy up. Just bear with me 1 second. There we go. So what I'm showing you now is the volunteer policy that I've created for the community warehouse. And it includes all the information. It's like the bare minimum as to what a volunteer policy should include. Obviously you can add extra things in there to suit your organisation, but what I'm going to show you will just be what should be included in the policy. So each organisation is different. You've just got to find what is best for you and what fits. Some organisations like to have a shorter policy, which refers to other documents, which I find works really well. So i.e. you can refer to a handbook or a separate policy like equal opportunities policy, confidentiality, etc. And also depending on the size of your group or organisation, some may have a volunteer policy and staff policy together. So for example, recently I supported an organisation in Rochdale. They had 2 members of paid staff, but the rest were solely volunteers. So they actually had the same policy for both, but they just highlighted under the relevant sections what was different for the staff and for volunteers. For example, the expenses, so there'd be staff and volunteers underneath. Yeah, the intersections. So that's exactly up to you how you want to do it, but I find it works better to refer to the documents as it keeps it a bit shorter for the volunteers to sort of process. So yeah, this is the community warehouse volunteer policy that I've recently created. I thought I'd show you this because it's a new one that I've just done. I have got templates and things to send out afterwards on how to make your agreement and what should be involved in your policies, etc. So I will share them with you. So to start off with this policy, a mission statement. Not everyone will have a mission statement, but I think it's really good to have one, something short and snappy that just says what it is that your organisation or group does. We came up with this mission statement through speaking to the volunteers and people involved in the community warehouse. So it's a joint effort to put this together. So it's just short and snappy, it just says exactly what it is that we do. An introduction, so a bit of an introduction about the community warehouse. For those that don't know, it was an idea that came from the Food Solutions Network, which we sort of are a part of, sort of helped set this community warehouse up. So it just says a bit about what the community warehouse is about and what it does. And also an important bit to having this sort of introduction of your policy is a bit about volunteers, why they're important and why you want to involve them. So here, the community warehouse is run by volunteers. Although there's one member of our staff there at the moment, eventually it's just going to Action Together stepping out and it's going to be just run by volunteers and they're going to have their whole committee, etc. So for now we do have a member of staff there, but otherwise it's run solely by volunteers. So the volunteers are extremely important and valued. The volunteers' role is vital in helping deliver support to the people and communities that we serve to enable the voluntary community, faith and social enterprise sector provide emergency supplies for homes in people of crisis, which is what the community warehouse is about, and it just says how volunteers are a part of that. And then principles, so we just listed a few of the principles that obviously the community warehouse will ensure all volunteers are properly integrated, make their experience a positive one, that we respect all volunteers are different and we'll work with you to ensure your needs as well as you meeting ours, and we recognise that volunteers require satisfying work and personal development and we'll seek to help the volunteers to meet these needs. So yeah, very important to have that in the beginning. It just gives the volunteers straight away an introduction into what it is they're going into and how they'll be involved. And then on to more the practical aspects of the involvement of volunteers. So recruitment, just obviously just to say how it is that you're recruiting for the role. So at the moment, the community warehouse roles are advertised via ourselves. So Action Together's websites, our social media platforms, and it also goes into our newsletters. And then just going to say how we recruit. So our volunteers that come to us for the community warehouse, a role description will be given, and that will be prepared by email or paper. Volunteers will receive a welcome pack consisting of their volunteer policy, a personal details form, volunteer agreement, and they will be asked to provide relevant ID prior to induction. That's just for our records. And then once inducted, they'll be given days and times of volunteering role, etc. Volunteer agreements, and we'll touch on volunteer agreements a bit after this. But yeah, you need a bit about volunteer agreements in your policy. So each community warehouse volunteer will receive a volunteer agreement establishing what the community warehouse does for them and what we expect of the volunteer. And then you'll notice this bit I've put in here, it's also in the agreement. So this agreement is not a contract, or this policy is not a contract. The community warehouse has no intention of creating a contract with any of its volunteers, and the agreement can be cancelled at any time by yourself, the volunteer, or the community warehouse. It's very important not to make a policy sound like a contract, because that's not what volunteers are. That's not what should be done for volunteers. On to induction and training. So a bit about receiving induction into the community warehouse. At the moment, we're doing our inductions for the community warehouse via Zoom, but they used to be in person at the warehouse. So I just put a bit in there about how you do your inductions, and the purpose of the induction. And also on your induction, it's good to touch on equality and diversity, health and safety, and confidentiality, which is also further down in the policy. So training for the volunteer role will be provided as appropriate. And also part of the community warehouse, we have free level 2 manual handling food hygiene training regularly available from the council. It is optional, they don't have to go onto it. We would like the community warehouse volunteers to attend this to get it's fully accredited, they get free, they get a level 2 certificate at the end to show their participation. Moving on, support and supervision. So again, this is entirely what support and supervision you intend to give your volunteers. So for the community warehouse, they have regular support and supervision throughout their volunteering role. And the volunteer coordinator, which is currently Sarah, she holds an optional monthly Zoom session to meet with all volunteers outside of the warehouse. So that can be to discuss any problems, issues, training needs, and we can also gather feedback, progress within the role, and answer any questions that the volunteers may have. It's just a space for volunteers to go outside of the role and to have a nice chat, just to have a get together at the moment, because we can't do that in person, obviously outside the role. So it's just a nice space for volunteers to attend. Moving down, so expenses. Expenses is an important one for volunteers. Some volunteers find don't always drive, they get on the bus, and we do have a lot of queries about expenses, if the ticket can be refunded, etc. Some places even cover dinner for their volunteers, so if you're going to cover sort of cost of a dinner, make sure you put that in there. But so volunteers are valued greatly at the community warehouse, and they will have travel expenses to and from the community warehouse reimbursed. But they will also, if we ask them to go and travel out to like make a delivery or pick food up for us, they will also have them sort of expenses. As long as it's something they're doing for the warehouse, they'll have everything covered. And there's a form for them to fill in. If they want to claim that back, it goes to our finance department, and that's paid to their bank. Confidentiality, you don't need to have as much in these next three categories because most people will have separate policies for these. So we have separate policies for confidentiality, health and safety, and equal opportunities. So you can just put volunteers must adhere to the community warehouse confidentiality policy, which is available on request, and it's the same with all of them. So you can provide copies of them if you like, or if they request them, provide copies for them to sort of look at and understand. Resolving problems and complaints. This is quite an important one because it does happen. There are complaints and problems do arise with volunteering. Sometimes they don't always feel like they can go to people within the warehouse. So obviously the volunteer coordinator is a point of contact. What it just says, we aim to identify and solve problems at the earliest possible stage, and a procedure has been drawn up for dealing with complaints either or by or about volunteers. So it's not just for volunteers, it's for either side, and you'll fully be supported through this procedure. We do have a complaints policy document I will also send out to you. It's just a template which you can adapt to your organisation also. And the final one on there is insurance. So volunteers are, at the moment, they're covered by Action Together's public liability insurance, while on the community warehouse property or on task for the community warehouse. But once Action Together pull out, and it's run solely by, it's its own thing, and it's run by volunteers and they have their own committee, etc., that will need to be changed for their own insurance. They'll have to get their own insurance in place. But that's, as to what should be in a policy, that's the bare minimum as to what is good to have in a policy. You can feel free to add more in there. It depends on your organisation. There was one thing that I did have in there, but I took out, which I may add back in. It was something called volunteer's voice. So it just gives the volunteer that knowledge that if they can speak out about things if they want to, there's not going to be any comeback from it whatsoever. They can have their own opinion, they can have their own voice and speak about whatever it is they need to speak about. So I will stop sharing that. And again, if there's any questions coming up, just please do put them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end. So I'll just reshare my presentation, do bear with me. So I'll just share the policy. So volunteer agreement. So part of your policy should refer to the volunteer agreement, which you noticed in the policy I just showed you. So a volunteer agreement is a description of the arrangement between the organisation and the volunteer for the voluntary work that they'll be doing. It informs the volunteer what they can expect from the organisation and what the organisation will do for them. And it will largely be determined by what's in the volunteer policies and a specific document based on individual volunteers' needs. So what I will do now I'm going to show you a volunteer agreement that I've also created. Bear with me. And again, I do have templates for all these, so I can share the templates with you afterwards. And I find it works a lot better to have a separate agreement to a policy. That's just my preference. I mean, some people, you can have your policy and then on the last page have your agreement, so it's all part of the same document. It's entirely up to you. Yeah, so the volunteer agreements, this is Community Warehouse's volunteer agreement. So volunteers are an important and valued part of the Community Warehouse. We hope you enjoy volunteering with us and we hope you feel part of our team. So the volunteer agreement describes the arrangement between the Community Warehouse and the volunteer. So top here, we, the Community Warehouse, will, and that's what we'll do. Quite a lot of it is from the policy. You'll see provide a full induction and any training for the volunteer role. Offer you our regular support, supervision and any feedback we deem necessary. Cover any expenses incurred with travel to and from the warehouse. Provide an optional Zoom meeting wellbeing session. Respect your skills, dignity, individual wishes and do our best to meet them. Provide insurance cover. Implement good health and safety, which is very important at the moment in the current time. Ensure you are treated in accordance with our equal opportunities policy, provide a safe workplace and apply our complaints procedure if there's a problem. And then for these specific roles at the warehouse, because the warehouse is only open 2 days at the moment, so Monday and a Wednesday. So we give the volunteers the option of doing a full day or a half day morning or afternoon shift. So the volunteer will follow policies and procedures relevant to their self and the role they'll be undertaking, work to the best of their ability, maintain confidentiality, and make a specific time commitment, only because it helps with the rotas with the specific roles, because the warehouse is only so big, we can only have so many volunteers there at one time. So it just helps us with the rotas and making sure we've got the right amount of people in. Obviously, if it's busy, we need more people, but not over the limit we're allowed. So they would just tick which shift they can do. And if that changes going forward, they'll just let us know. Inform the Community Warehouse if I'm unable to do my voluntary work and provide references if required. I thought that was an important one. Although we don't ask for references, some organisations or groups you may do. So it's fine to have that on there. And also I've not put anything on there about DBS. It's because we don't ask for DBSs to work at to volunteer at the warehouse. But if you do, I'd maybe just add something in there about to let you do a DBS check for them, etc. And then more details can be found in the policies. And again, I've put here, this agreement is in honour only. It's not intended to be a legally binding contract of employment, or either Community Warehouse or yourself can end the agreement at any time. It's good to have that in there so they know that it's not a contract. It's just, you know, it's all by word. They can end it whenever they like. And then just sign, print, sign, we sign. They keep a copy, we can keep a copy. And that's it. So I'll stop sharing that. And I'll just go back to, sorry about this, go back to the presentation. Yeah, so that's volunteer agreement. So what to avoid in a volunteer agreement or policy? So the first point I've put on here is contracts of employment. It's very easily done to develop a policy or agreement and to make it sound like a contract. Volunteer policies and agreement should not be written in a way to create a contract of employment. A volunteer policy helps to clarify the unique contribution of volunteers and to make an organisation, and shows how this is different from paid staff. So avoid the language of legal rights and obligations. In order to be certain of not creating a legal contract with volunteers, here are a few measures that can be taken when creating your policy or agreement. So with the language, it's more of not using language like employer, employment, or referring to any sort of entitlement like sick leave, annual leave, because obviously it's not relevant. And also like words like contract, because it's not, you know, it's not a legal contract. So insert a clear statement on written documents that no relationship of employment is being created, which I showed you in the policy and the agreement. As you saw, I showed you I had that sentence, this agreement isn't honour only. It's not only intended to be legally binding, it's not intended to be a legally binding contract, and neither either Community Warehouse or yourself can end the agreement at any time. Very important to have that in there. It just shows them obviously that they're not obliged, they can cancel any time if they don't want to attend anymore. Ensure that your policy is a working document and practice how your organisation works with volunteers as your policy states. Volunteers want to feel valued and respected, and it's just a good way of showing that, to be fair. A good policy, you know, makes a volunteer and they feel more valued and respected. I'll just stop sharing something. Yep. And that has been pretty quick, actually. I thought it might have took me a bit longer than that. So I am open to questions. I have templates available I can send out for the policy and agreement and also the complaints procedure. So far, I've supported Healthwatch Rochdale, Get Up and Grow, and Rochdale Dower Centre. And if you need any support whatsoever, I'm here to help you. There's my contact details there. There's just a bit of feedback on the last page. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it with the pictures at the side, all of it, but I can send the presentation out afterwards as well. And that's from Rochdale Dower Centre and Healthwatch Rochdale. Yeah, so I'll give you a minute to read through that. I think that's my presentation, a lot quicker than what I thought it would be. So questions are welcome. Any questions? I'm all ears.